Welcome back to the Action Zone. You're watching Undisputed Wrestling Desk, where WWE comes alive. Subscribe and get ready for the latest updates. CM Punk's World Championship triumph should have been a quiet moment of vindication. A long, complicated road finally arriving at the top of the mountain. Instead, he turned the celebration into a declaration, not of revenge in the literal sense, but of accountability. With the title still warm around his waist, Punk stared straight into the camera and promised Paul Heyman that this chapter was over, that the manipulations, the ambushes, and the relentless undermining would be answered not with senseless fury, but with methodical, inescapable consequences. What makes this moment electric is less the heat of the words and more the discipline behind them. A champion choosing to use his platform to dismantle a system that weaponized people for another man's advantage. This is the start of a campaign to expose. The moment that rewrote the rulebook. When Punk walked out of the ring, the belt heavy and the crowd buzzing, he didn't celebrate with fireworks. He issued an ultimatum. The difference between an ordinary heel-face beatdown and what Punk proposed is intention. Punk's words weren't a promise of physical obliteration. They were a commitment to finally make the architect of so many careers face the consequences of his choices. That distinction matters because it elevates the storyline from a cycle of violence into a larger critique of power structures in WWE. Punk wants Heyman to be accountable in every dimension, professionally, reputationally, and institutionally. He's not just a champion looking for retribution, he's a leader with influence, and he intends to use that influence to change the rules of engagement, to stop people being disposable pawns and force the company to reckon with the human cost of manipulation. How Punk's victory changes the balance of power. A title in hand changes everything. Being world champion gives Punk leverage he didn't have before. Contractual clout, the ability to dictate match stipulations, media attention, and a wider audience for his message. This isn't about Punk getting street justice. It's about him leveraging organizational mechanics to restrict Heyman's capacity to operate from the shadows. Imagine stipulations that ban named parties from ringside, matches that require Heyman to be present under oath-like conditions, or authority-driven clauses that limit interference. Punk can force Heyman into the light. That pressure will reveal cracks in the faction's armor, create public scrutiny, and compel management to act, not because they like Punk, but because the optics of a champion wielding the company's attention are impossible to ignore. The strategy: expose, isolate, and rebuild. Punk's campaign is surgical rather than savage. First, expose. Use interviews, in-ring segments, and legislative-style promos to document a paper trail of manipulations and questionable decisions. Second, isolate. Chip away at Heyman's enablers by forcing decisions that make it costly to shield him, contracts that remove managerial advantage, match types that prevent outside assistance, or public pressure that drives sponsors and executives to distance themselves. Third, rebuild. Restore agency to the wrestlers who've been used, offering them paths back to autonomy and dignity rather than continuing to be rallying points for someone else's agenda. This approach transforms the revenge narrative into one of institutional reform, which is rarer and more satisfying than a simple heel beatdown. The human cost behind the headlines. What makes this storyline land is empathy. Punk's promise is anchored to real damage, careers derailed, reputation stained, and people turned into narrative devices. If WWE leans into the human toll, interviews with performers who recount feeling used, moments that show the long-term wear on bodies and minds, and scenes where managers and wrestlers confront what they've sacrificed, the arc becomes more than entertainment. It becomes resonant. Punk's role shifts from avenger to advocate, and that shift allows fans to root for systemic change rather than temporary catharsis. The emotional stakes remain high because the consequences are personal, not merely competitive. Collateral fallout. What happens to division? Division has already shown strain. Internal fractures make it vulnerable to a campaign that targets its infrastructure rather than its fighters. Punk's methodical approach will force members to take public stands. Do they defend Heyman and risk being complicit, or do they distance themselves and possibly salvage their careers? Either path has costs. If they cling to Heyman, they become political liabilities and targets for sanctions. If they abandon him, the faction collapses, but individual wrestlers may find new, more honest narratives. Punk's pressure creates a crucible. Identities will be tested, loyalties recalibrated, and a number of careers will either find new life or quietly fade. That kind of dramatic realignment is fertile ground for long-term storytelling, and rarely have such internal reckonings felt this consequential on Raw. Management, media, and the moment's momentum. Punk's declaration will force WWE's corporate and creative bodies to react, and those reactions will define whether the storyline becomes legendary or forgettable. Ideally, management will be compelled to intervene transparently, holding hearings, imposing sanctions, or at the very least creating a formal investigative backdrop that gives Punk institutional leverage. Media coverage matters too. If sports and pop culture press pick up the narrative about accountability, WWE can't easily sweep it under the rug. That public scrutiny creates a feedback loop that amplifies stakes and makes every segment feel weighty. Punk's ability to translate a mic moment into a wider cultural conversation is what separates career-defining angles from ephemeral heat. Payoff. What real justice looks like. If Punk's campaign is executed with patience, the payoff won't be a single violent encounter, but a sequence of reckonings, reputational unravelings, contractual consequences, and restored agency for those hurt. A compelling finish could see Heyman forced into a corner, professionally marginalized, publicly exposed, and stripped of the kind of influence that allowed him to hide. That outcome would validate Punk's strategy. Destruction replaced by dismantling, chaos replaced by order, manipulation replaced by accountability. More than that, it would leave room for human reconciliation where appropriate. Some relationships may be repaired, others irreparable. The emotional truth in that ambiguity is what would make this storyline linger in fans' memories long after the final beat. Why this story matters beyond the ring. At its best, wrestling can mirror larger social conversations about power, accountability, and responsibility. Punk's angle taps into those themes without resorting to gratuitous violence. He's not promising to physically annihilate a man. He's promising to use the spotlight responsibly to make change. That's a rarer, kinder, yet no less dramatic, form of storytelling. It gives wrestlers something substantive to act toward, gives fans a narrative that rewards attention and debate, and gives the company an opportunity to show moral courage. If executed with honesty and care, this could become a template. How a champion leverages influence to correct institutional wrongs, and how entertainment can reflect the idea that consequences, when thoughtfully applied, are more meaningful than spectacle.